Summer, 1943. The air in Tennessee was heavy with humidity, thick enough to make the wooden walls of Camp Crossville sweat. Behind the wire, a young German soldier leaned over the counter of the camp canteen, his eyes fixed on a glass bottle filled with a mysterious brown liquid. The bottle hissed when opened, fizz rising to the surface, tiny bubbles clinging to the glass like living creatures. He had never seen anything like it. For 2 years he had fought in the baking deserts of North Africa, surviving on hard biscuits, tins of greasy meat, and the bitter punishment of ersatz coffee. That had been food for survival, not pleasure. Yet here, in captivity, he was offered something entirely alien: Coca-Cola. It cost 5 cents, the guards explained casually, the same price American children paid with their pocket money. The German took his first sip, and it was as though his tongue had been transported into another world. Sweet, sharp, effervescent, it was both utterly unnecessary and completely overwhelming. All around him, his comrades were discovering the same shock. They had been raised on Nazi propaganda that painted Americans as weak, decadent, and incapable of sacrifice. But in the small, everyday luxuries of camp life, those illusions began to crumble. Here, ice cream appeared as a routine dessert. Candy bars were stacked in piles so large they could be handed out as if they were nothing. To Germans who had grown up in a world of scarcity, these simple foods felt like a dream. It was not only the taste that startled them, but what it represented. In Germany, sugar was rationed to the gram, chocolate reserved for the well-connected, and soft drinks nearly unknown. In America, children carried candy to school, workers drank Coca-Cola on their breaks, and prisoners of war, men who had once marched under Hitler-S banners, were given access to such things as a matter of course. Some POWs muttered to themselves, wondering if this was some kind of trick, a staged display to weaken their spirit. Yet the more they observed, the clearer it became. This abundance was not propaganda, but ordinary reality. Every bite of chocolate, every fizz of soda, every melting scoop of ice cream revealed a society that had turned industrial capacity into a weapon more powerful than any rifle. A few soldiers later recalled that moment with almost spiritual clarity. One described the first Coca-Cola he ever tasted as like drinking the future. The drink was unnecessary, frivolous even, yet its very existence said more than words ever could. America could afford to spend sugar, glass, refrigeration, and time on something purely for enjoyment, even for its enemies. The irony was impossible to miss. In Berlin, officials spoke of sacrifice and heroic deprivation. In Tennessee, the prisoners discovered a world where pleasure itself was manufactured in endless supply. They realized that deprivation in Germany was not proof of nobility, but evidence of failure. The mathematics of war were being rewritten not only on battlefields, but in candy aisles and soda fountains. Every evening at Camp Crossville, the prisoners gathered in their barracks, whispering about what they had seen, what they had tasted. Their voices carried disbelief, curiosity, and a growing unease. Could the Reich, with all its grand promises, ever truly compete with a country where ice cream was casual and Coca-Cola universal? They didn't know it yet, but that first sip, that first taste of America, had already begun the slow, quiet transformation that would outlast barbed wire and guard towers. What began as astonishment at sweets would become the seed of an ideological collapse. The lesson was simple, yet devastating. America's strength was not just in its armies, but in its ability to make even luxury feel ordinary. And for men who had lived on scarcity, nothing was more disarming than discovering that their enemies had so much they could afford to share it freely, even with them. May 1943, the desert wind of Tunisia carried more dust than hope. For months, Rommel's Afrika Korps had fought with desperate courage, retreating step by step across the North African sands. They had endured heat that blistered the skin, thirst that clawed at the throat, and rations so thin they barely kept a man upright. Bread grew hard as stone, coffee was replaced with bitter acorns or chicory, and meat, when it appeared at all, was stringy and scarce. When the surrender finally came, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. They expected chains, beatings, and starvation. Nazi propaganda had promised nothing less. Americans were said to be brutal, undisciplined, eager to humiliate their captives. Many prisoners braced themselves for weeks of suffering, certain that the enemy would treat them as subhumans. But the moment of surrender delivered its first surprise. Instead of blows or insults, American soldiers handed out rations. K-rations, they called them. To the Germans, they looked like treasure chests wrapped in cardboard. Inside were crackers that snapped cleanly instead of crumbling, processed cheese in tins, fruit bars, candy, instant coffee, sugar tablets, even cigarettes. Some of these items had not passed German lips in years. Hardened desert veterans who had faced tanks and artillery without flinching now stared wide-eyed at a package of biscuits and a slab of chocolate. At the processing camps in North Africa, the astonishment deepened. Military records show that the U.S. Army served pancakes dripping with syrup, fresh eggs sizzling in pans, and tall glasses of milk poured without hesitation. For the German soldiers, these were ghost foods, items that had disappeared from their own rations long before. Many prisoners ate with tears in their eyes, chewing slowly, as though they feared the meal might vanish if they finished too quickly. One officer would later testify before the International Red Cross, "We expected to be starved as prisoners. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army had. This confusion about American resources began our education." And indeed, it was the beginning of something larger than nourishment. For years, they had been told that German sacrifice was noble, that the shortages at home were proof of shared strength, that America's consumer society was weak and decadent. But here, in captivity, they were being shown a different truth. America possessed not only the will to fight, but the capacity to produce more than anyone thought possible. The desert surrender marked more than a military defeat. It was the opening act of a psychological unraveling. The Germans had marched into Africa convinced of their superiority. They left it eating pancakes, tasting the first sweetness of a world that Nazi ideology had hidden from them. As they prepared for transport across the ocean, their bellies full in a way they had not known for years, many prisoners began to whisper questions they would never have dared ask before. If America could feed its enemies like this, what could it give its own people? And what kind of future could Germany offer, built on sacrifice, when its adversary seemed capable of turning abundance into an everyday fact of life? The answers would come slowly, carried across the Atlantic, but the first cracks in certainty had already appeared, not from bullets or bombs, but from the simple act of being handed a warm breakfast by the very men they had been taught to despise. The prisoners had expected to be crammed into dark, airless holds, left to rot in chains while crossing the Atlantic. Many imagined scenes from old seafaring tales: disease, starvation, and brutality at the hands of their captors. Instead, what greeted them on the docks of Oran and Algiers was something utterly foreign: Liberty ships. The vessels themselves were plain and functional, mass-produced steel giants that America built faster than Germany could sink them. To the prisoners, their very existence was staggering. Where Germany struggled to keep even a few submarines and destroyers in the water, the United States was launching ships by the dozens each week, as though they had been conjured from an endless supply line. Each Liberty ship was not elegant but practical, a floating factory of efficiency. When the POWs boarded, they were stunned again. Instead of shackles, they found hammocks slung neatly in rows. Instead of filthy slop, American cooks prepared meals with a variety most had not seen since childhood: stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread that still smelled of yeast, canned fruit drenched in syrup, and coffee served hot 3 times a day. On some voyages, even ice cream appeared, delivered in metal tubs from shipboard freezers. At night, the ships rumbled steadily westward, their engines cutting through the swells, while Navy escorts kept watch against U-boats. In the hammocks, German soldiers whispered in disbelief. "If this is how they treat prisoners," one man muttered, "how do they treat their own?" The question hung in the salty air, heavier than any propaganda leaflet could have been. On deck, the Atlantic horizon stretched endlessly, a shifting line of blue that seemed to pull them toward an unknown future. Guard towers stood watchful, but the atmosphere was not one of cruelty. Prisoners were allowed time to walk the deck, smoke cigarettes, and even exchange words with American sailors. Young men their own age, joking, relaxed, and astonishingly well-fed. Some guards shared chocolate or chewing gum, small tokens that hit the Germans harder than any insult. The journey revealed not only abundance, but confidence. America was moving prisoners across an ocean as though it were nothing, confident enough in its resources to spend precious cargo space on enemy soldiers rather than letting them rot in desert cages. The message was unmistakable. The United States had already won the war of production. The very ships beneath their feet, prefabricated, welded together, and sent out by the thousands, proved it. Days stretched into weeks, and with each passing sunrise, the Germans left behind more than geography. They were drifting away from a world of ration cards, shortages, and fear, and sailing toward a country where even prisoners of war could expect comfort, safety, and the strange luxury of 3 full meals a day. By the time the Liberty ships reached the eastern seaboard, docking at New York, Norfolk, or Boston, the prisoners were not only dazed by the long voyage, but also by what they had seen and tasted. America was no longer an abstraction painted by Goebbels' propaganda machine. It was real, solid, and immense, embodied in the ships that carried them, the food that sustained them, and the quiet generosity of the men guarding them. As they prepared to disembark under the shadow of skyscrapers or factory chimneys, many German soldiers realized the truth with a clarity that no battlefield had provided. They were entering the heart of a nation whose strength lay not merely in armies, but in an ocean of plenty. And once again, abundance, not force, was reshaping how they understood the war. When the Liberty ships finally slid into American harbors, the German prisoners pressed against the rails, craning their necks at the skyline. For many, it was their first glimpse of the United States. Towers of steel, cranes swinging endlessly, factories roaring day and night. To men who had grown up under ration cards and blackouts, the sight of cities blazing with electric light felt almost unreal. America, they realized, was not merely large, it was inexhaustible. At the docks, Red Cross officials and American MPs managed the disembarkation with an efficiency that startled the prisoners. They expected shouts, rifle butts, maybe humiliation. Instead, the process was calm, orderly, and strangely impersonal. Lines were formed, names checked, belongings catalogued. Some prisoners even recalled being given sandwiches and coffee as they waited. The journey inland took them through a landscape unlike anything they had imagined. Trains carried them past rolling farmland that seemed to stretch without end, silos full of grain rising like monuments across the plains. Entire convoys of trucks rumbled along highways wider than most German streets. Where their homeland bore the scars of bombing and scarcity, America displayed a landscape of plenty, cattle herds like moving seas, orchards heavy with fruit, rivers feeding fields green and endless. One prisoner later wrote, "We believed the Allies were starving like us, but as the train moved, we saw barns bursting with hay, towns glittering with neon signs, and children walking with ice cream cones in their hands. It was like looking through a window into another world." The camps themselves, scattered across the American South, Midwest, and Great Plains, reinforced the shock. Barbed wire and guard towers defined the boundaries, yet inside, life was strangely humane. Wooden barracks offered real beds with clean sheets. Canteens sold candy, cigarettes, even Coca-Cola, luxuries that had disappeared from Germany years earlier. Most astonishing of all, the prisoners were fed 3 times a day, often with meat, milk, and fresh vegetables. Some POWs whispered among themselves that this must be a trick, a softening strategy to make them compliant. But day after day, the meals arrived. Week after week, the guards remained professional, even friendly. And slowly, disbelief turned to a troubling realization. This was normal. The abundance was not for show. It was simply how America lived. The contrast to Germany could not have been sharper. Back home, their families were queuing for scraps, substituting turnips for bread, grinding acorns for coffee, boiling nettles for soup. Letters from home spoke of hunger and fear, of cities reduced to rubble. Yet here, across the ocean, their captors handed out chocolate bars as casually as if they were nothing. For many prisoners, arrival in America marked the true beginning of captivity, not because of fences or guards, but because it confronted them with a truth they had never been allowed to imagine. Germany, for all its sacrifices, could never match this scale of wealth, this rhythm of plenty. America was not only winning the war with weapons, it was winning it with refrigerators, factories, railroads, and grocery stores overflowing with food. The prisoners could not escape, not from the barbed wire, but from the knowledge pressing deeper each day. They were standing inside the future, and it did not belong to the Reich. The first mornings inside the American camps always began with the same sound, a bugle call drifting over the barracks, followed by the shuffle of boots on gravel. the German prisoners rose from real beds, mattresses stuffed with springs, not straw, pulling on clean uniforms issued by the U.S. Army. For men who had expected chains and filth, the routine felt strangely civilized, almost domestic. Meals set the rhythm of the day. Breakfast was hot, hearty, and bewildering. Eggs fried in butter, thick slices of bacon, oatmeal sweetened with sugar, and coffee that tasted strong instead of bitter. Sometimes there were oranges, peeled and bright, their tangy sweetness exploding on tongues that had nearly forgotten fruit. Lunch and dinner followed the same pattern: meat, vegetables, bread, milk, served in quantities that seemed endless. For many prisoners, the war's greatest shock was not battle, but abundance. Yet life behind the wire was not simply a feast. Work was required. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be assigned labor, and America used them well. Groups were sent to harvest cotton in Texas, pick peaches in Georgia, chop timber in the Midwest, or mend roads across the plains. Farmers came to the camp gates in trucks, grateful for the extra hands. Some treated the Germans with indifference, others with warmth, offering water, cookies, or even casual conversation. The work created an unexpected bond. A prisoner who once marched through Africa under Rommel's banner now stood in an Arkansas field beside American farm boys his own age, both sweating under the same sun. Sometimes, with guards looking the other way, they swapped words of English and German, or traded small gifts: a hand-rolled cigarette, a pencil, a photograph of family. Slowly, enemy faces became human ones. Inside the camp, the barracks became small societies of their own. Prisoners organized orchestras with instruments provided by the YMCA, staged theater plays, even formed soccer leagues that drew crowds of fellow POWs and curious guards. Libraries appeared, stocked with English textbooks, novels, and technical manuals. For many Germans, this was their first chance to study America not as caricature, but as reality, through language, through music, through the taste of daily life. But not all was harmony. Ideological battles rumbled beneath the surface. Hardline Nazis tried to maintain control, painting the Americans' generosity as weakness, insisting that the Reich would rise again. They bullied younger or disillusioned soldiers, sometimes violently. In some camps, factions formed: the true believers versus those who quietly admitted that Germany's promises had been lies. Guards often had to separate them, moving extremists to isolated compounds. Still, time itself worked against fanaticism. As weeks became months, the monotony of camp life turned the small pleasures — ice cream on Sundays, a letter from home, a cigarette after work — into proof that the outside world was wider than propaganda allowed. Many POWs began to sense that Germany had offered them struggle without end, while America, even in captivity, offered dignity. Perhaps the most startling realization came during paydays. Prisoners received small wages for their labor, which they could spend at the camp canteen. Behind the counter sat jars of candy, stacks of magazines, cold bottles of Coca-Cola, and even postcards. To earn money, to buy sweets or a soda of their choosing, while technically prisoners of war, it felt like stepping into a paradox. Captivity had become more comfortable than the freedom they had left behind in Germany. At night, as the lights of the guard towers flickered against the wire, the prisoners lay in their bunks, bellies full, minds restless. They were safe, warm, and strangely respected. And with each passing day, the certainty that had once driven them, the belief in German superiority, in Hitler's destiny, eroded like sand through open fingers. Life inside the camps was not just survival, it was education, quiet and unrelenting. The lesson was simple: abundance could break a man as faith more effectively than hunger or pain. By the winter of 1944, the Germans inside the camps had grown used to a daily rhythm of work, meals, and rest. Yet there was one thing that continued to haunt their imagination, a symbol more potent than rifles or tanks: the glass bottle of Coca-Cola. What had begun as a novelty, a sweet, fizzy drink unlike anything they had known, became something more. For many POWs, that first sip marked the moment when America stopped being an abstraction and became a lived reality. It was not just sugar and carbonation, it was industrial magic. How could a country afford to give even its prisoners a drink so unnecessary, so frivolous, and yet so perfectly made? In Germany, war rationing had stripped life bare. Chocolate had disappeared, sugar was rationed to crumbs, and beer itself grew thin and watery. But in America, Coca-Cola was everywhere. It appeared in camp canteens, in village stores, even delivered by trucks to farmers who worked beside POW labor crews. Sometimes American guards handed out bottles casually, the crown caps snapping off with a flick of a bayonet. To the Germans, it felt like a miracle handed out for 5 cents. Soon, Coca-Cola became a quiet obsession. Prisoners saved the bottles, studied the curves of the glass, traced the logo with their fingers as though it were a relic from another civilization. They spoke of it at night in the barracks, joking that the drink contained some secret American potion. One man declared, "This is not a drink, this is proof." And in a way, it was. Coca-Cola represented what the Reich could never offer, a society where pleasure itself was mass-produced, affordable, and distributed even in wartime. It was a democratic luxury. Anyone, from a factory worker in Chicago to a prisoner of war in Texas, could hold the same bottle, taste the same sweetness. No propaganda could erase the contrast. The U.S. government understood this power more than the Germans realized. General Eisenhower himself had ensured that Coca-Cola bottling plants were built near the front, guaranteeing soldiers a taste of home. For every rifle shipped overseas, it seemed another crate of Coke followed. Where German troops received thin soup and speeches about sacrifice, American troops marched with candy bars in their pockets and soda bottles in their hands. Inside the camps, the effect was corrosive to Nazi pride. Hardliners tried to dismiss Coca-Cola as childish, a symbol of decadence. But their words rang hollow when the same men were later seen sipping it with quiet pleasure. The fizzing sweetness eroded ideology, not with argument but with experience. Years later, former POWs would remember the war not only in terms of battles but in tastes. Many admitted that Coca-Cola, more than any speech or leaflet, revealed the true difference between the world they had lost and the world they had entered. It was not the taste alone, it was what it stood for: abundance, equality, and a casual confidence that the future belonged to those who could make even luxury seem ordinary. In the end, Coca-Cola became more than a drink. It was America in a bottle, democracy made liquid, a weapon that conquered not with firepower but with bubbles. And for thousands of German prisoners behind American barbed wire, it marked the first time they understood that the Reich had already lost, not only on the battlefield but in the factories, the farms, and even in the fizz of a soda glass. If Coca-Cola shocked the prisoners with its fizz and sweetness, then ice cream struck even deeper, into memory. For many Germans, the taste of ice cream belonged to childhood, to summers before the war, when city streets smelled of roasted chestnuts and laughter carried from fairgrounds. By 1943, such memories had been buried under years of shortages, air raids, and the hard crust of military life. In Germany, dairy and sugar had long been rationed. Ice cream had simply vanished. Yet in America, even prisoners of war were served it. It appeared casually, almost carelessly, scoops dropped into bowls in camp mess halls, sometimes vanilla, sometimes chocolate, sometimes strawberry swirled with fruit. On Sundays, farmers' wives brought it in steel tubs, the cold mist rising as the lids were lifted. The first spoonful left many Germans speechless. The frozen cream melted slowly on their tongues, impossibly rich, impossibly sweet, like tasting a world they had forgotten existed. Some prisoners laughed aloud, embarrassed by their own delight. Others grew quiet, struck by the cruelty of contrast, while their families back home boiled turnips. And gnawed on black bread, here they were eating ice cream under the watch of their enemies. It felt like betrayal to enjoy it, yet they could not stop. The cold sweetness was more than food, it was proof. Because ice cream, like Coca-Cola, was unnecessary. It required refrigeration, sugar, milk, and time, all luxuries Germany could no longer afford. To make it for prisoners of war was not just generosity, it was abundance on display. America could feed its citizens, its soldiers, and still have enough left over to offer desserts to the men who had once fought against them. Guards treated the moment with casual humor. "Don't eat too fast," one sergeant joked as a young POW winced at his first ice cream headache. The Germans chuckled nervously, spooning more, realizing that their captors not only controlled them, but also shared laughter with them. The small kindness broke walls more effectively than barbed wire ever could.
Years later, many former POWs would say they remembered their first American ice cream more vividly than their capture in Africa or the voyage across the Atlantic.
It was not just taste, it was revelation. A frozen spoonful became a window into another society, one that measured power not only in tanks and planes, but in the ability to make sweetness ordinary, even in war. For Nazi ideology, the damage was invisible but profound. Speeches about sacrifice and superiority could not compete with a scoop of chocolate melting on the tongue. Ice cream did not argue, it simply existed, and in its existence lay the quiet truth. America was fighting a different kind of war, one it had already won. Behind the wire, as the sun set and the guards called lights out, German soldiers lay in their bunks, replaying the day's small miracle. The war, the desert, the propaganda, all seemed far away. What lingered instead was the memory of cold sweetness in the heat of a southern afternoon, and the uneasy knowledge that they had tasted a future Germany could never give them. Sugar. That was the true shock. If Coca-Cola and ice cream dazzled the senses, then sugar, plain, white, abundant, shattered illusions. For German prisoners of war, sugar was the rarest treasure of all. Back home, families were rationed a mere 280 grams per month, and even that was unreliable. Housewives stretched it carefully, a spoonful in bitter coffee, a thin layer on Christmas cookies, if any could be spared. For soldiers, sugar was a memory, not a reality. And then, in America, they sat in mess halls where bowls of sugar rested openly on every table, not locked away, not rationed by the spoon, but placed casually, as though it were as common as air. "Help yourselves," the guards would say. And the Germans did, at first timidly, then with hunger that startled even themselves. Some poured it into coffee until the liquid turned syrupy. Others sprinkled it onto bread or even ate it by the spoonful, unable to believe that such extravagance could be permitted, let alone encouraged. One story from Camp Aliceville, Alabama, spread among the prisoners like legend. In the humid summer of 1943, a shipment of sugar hardened in the sacks. Back in Germany, such a supply would have been steamed, scraped, saved grain by grain. In Aliceville, the American kitchen staff simply threw it away and ordered more. German workers in the kitchen stood stunned, watching hundreds of pounds of sweetness consigned to the garbage as though it meant nothing. To them, it was not just waste, it was blasphemy against the reality they had known. The message was unavoidable. America had so much sugar that it could afford to discard it. Germany, by contrast, could not even feed its children properly. Psychologists later observed that sugar became a kind of ideological solvent. It was not propaganda, not speeches about democracy or capitalism. It was a bowl on a table, filled and refilled without concern. Each spoonful eroded the myth of Nazi superiority, replacing it with something undeniable. How could a weak, decadent nation produce such plenty while the supposedly superior Reich starved its own people? Prisoners began to compare stories. Some had worked in German bakeries before the war, where sugar was weighed like gold, each gram accounted for. Others had grown up in small towns where children licked spoons coated with syrup because candy was too rare. Now they watched American kitchen staff whip sugar into cakes, pies, and puddings, served not once a year but weekly, even daily. For many, this was more disorienting than the battlefield. Losing to America's armies could be explained by numbers, by tanks and planes. But losing to sugar? That was harder to comprehend. And yet it was inescapable. The United States had built not just an army, but an entire economy capable of producing sweetness in quantities that seemed almost fantastical. In quiet moments, German prisoners confessed to each other that this, more than anything, broke their sense of German destiny. They had been told that scarcity was noble, that sacrifice was strength. But sitting in a camp in Tennessee or Texas, stirring sugar into coffee until it dissolved into sweetness, they began to see scarcity for what it truly was. Not destiny, not nobility, but weakness. And the greatest irony? This lesson in abundance was not taught in classrooms or propaganda halls. It was taught in silence by a white crystal that dissolved in water, a sweetness that lingered on the tongue long after the spoon was set down. If sugar loosened the threads of Nazi certainty, chocolate tore whole seams apart. For the average German soldier, chocolate had been a rare indulgence even before the war, By 1943, it was virtually unobtainable. The Wehrmacht reserved most supplies for special rations, often in bitter, high-caffeine bars meant to fuel forced marches rather than delight the taste buds. Children at home might not see a single piece of real chocolate for years. Sweetness, when it came, was ersatz, thin syrups, potato-based candies, meager substitutes that carried the faint memory of better days. In America, chocolate was not a treasure, it was ordinary. When German prisoners first encountered it in the camps, their reactions were mixed. Some refused at first, convinced it must be a trick or some inferior imitation, but the first bite of a Hershey bar or a Mars bar silenced all doubt. Smooth, rich, and plentiful, it melted on their tongues in a way no ersatz sweet ever could. Prisoners wrote home in censored letters, often with a tone of disbelief. "They give us chocolate here. Real chocolate." In the canteen, candy bars sold for a nickel, the same price American children paid at corner stores. To the Germans, that price tag was another revelation. Something that would have cost a fortune, if it could even be found in Germany, was pocket change in America. The guards, too, treated it casually. They would unwrap a bar, take a bite, and toss the rest aside without thought. To men raised in a world of shortages, that nonchalance was almost painful to watch. The Red Cross parcels only deepened the shock. Each box, delivered monthly, included coffee, crackers, canned meat, cigarettes, and chocolate. For German civilians, a single parcel represented a luxury greater than their entire monthly ration. For the prisoners, it was simply routine. And it wasn't just Hershey. Camp exchanges stocked brands from Mars, Nestlé, and regional makers. Americans debated whether they preferred Milky Way or Baby Ruth, Hershey or Nestlé Crunch, as if such abundance were not extraordinary, but normal. For the prisoners, even the idea of choice in chocolate was revolutionary. In Germany, choice had long since disappeared. Perhaps most striking was how chocolate fit into America's broader culture. Guards shared candy bars with each other while on duty. Children in nearby towns munched them after school. Soldiers bought them by the box to send home in letters. Chocolate, in America, was democratic. Everybody ate it, from generals to mechanics, from schoolchildren to prisoners of war. This universality undermined the Nazi worldview at its core. The Reich had built itself on hierarchy. Some deserved, most endured. But here was a society where even the enemy could eat chocolate regularly. It was a quiet but devastating lesson that prosperity could be shared without collapsing. Decades later, former prisoners recalled their first American chocolate more vividly than many battles they had fought. One described the moment as like holding the future in my hands, wrapped in paper. Another said his first Hershey bar tasted of freedom more than sugar. Chocolate did not lecture. It did not argue. It simply existed, in endless supply, given freely even to those who had once been enemies. And that reality, melting in their mouths, was a revolution that no Nazi speech could undo. Holidays behind barbed wire could have been cruel reminders of captivity, yet for many German prisoners they became moments of astonishment, times when the enemy revealed a generosity that defied everything Nazi propaganda had told them. Thanksgiving was the first surprise. Most Germans had never heard of the holiday, and when November came they assumed it would pass like any other day. Instead, the camp mess halls were decorated with American flags and cornucopias made of paper. Long tables were set with food far richer than usual: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, cornbread, pumpkin pie. Dishes they didn't even have names for in German were ladled out in portions so large that men accustomed to scarcity could scarcely finish their plates. Guards joked that everyone would leave heavier than they arrived. For prisoners who had marched hungry across North Africa or Europe, the sheer abundance was overwhelming. Christmas carried an even deeper shock. In Germany, Christmas had long been a sacred, family-centered holiday, made bleaker each year by the war. Candles were dim, gifts handmade from scraps, and sugar cookies stretched with ersatz ingredients. Yet in America's POW camps, the prisoners found decorated trees, Christmas carols sung by local church choirs outside the fences, and stockings filled with candy, cigarettes, and even small toys carved by volunteers. The Red Cross parcels grew more generous in December, often including chocolate, coffee, and tinned fruit. Sometimes local women's groups or church congregations donated cakes, knitted scarves, or books. Children from nearby towns wrote cards addressed simply to a German prisoner,
wishing them peace and goodwill.
For men trained to see Americans as monsters, these gestures felt unreal, almost disarming. Perhaps the most unforgettable tradition was the holiday feast. At camps in Texas, Alabama, and elsewhere, German prisoners sat down to meals of ham, roast beef, potatoes, pies, and, most shocking of all, ice cream, even in winter. In some camps, guards and prisoners ate together, clinking coffee cups in a fragile but sincere truce of humanity. One POW later recalled, "That was the day I realized we were not the master race. The people who captured us lived better, even in war, than we had ever lived." Even non-Christian prisoners found themselves swept into the spirit. The Americans celebrated Hanukkah for Jewish POWs and Easter in spring with colored eggs and cakes. It wasn't propaganda, it was custom, routine, a reflection of how deeply abundance and festivity were woven into American life. The holidays became moments when captivity felt less like punishment and more like bewildering privilege. Men wrote in letters home, when censors allowed it, that they had eaten more in one Christmas in America than in 3 years in Germany. Those words, smuggled through ink and paper, carried their own quiet power. Families back home reading about turkeys and pies began to wonder whether the Reich's promised glory was nothing but hunger and lies. The barbed wire was still there, the war still raged, but inside the camps, holiday tables told a story stronger than any sermon, a story of plenty, of generosity, and of a society that celebrated even with its enemies. By 1944, America's war machine was running at full speed, and so was its agriculture. Millions of young American men were overseas, leaving farms short-handed just as demand for food soared. The answer stood behind barbed wire, German POWs. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to work, provided it wasn't directly for the war effort. Farm labor fit perfectly. And so, buses and trucks rolled up to the camps each morning, ferrying groups of Germans into the surrounding countryside. Under guard, but with surprising freedom, they stepped onto cotton fields in Texas, cornfields in Iowa, orchards in California, and peanut farms in Georgia. For many, it was the first time they had touched American soil beyond the confines of camp. The work was hard, yes, but familiar, stooping, harvesting, hauling. It was not unlike the farm labor many of them had known back home, but the context was utterly different. In Germany, they had been soldiers, hailed as conquerors. Here they were farmhands, helping to feed the very nation that had captured them, and yet the experience often softened rather than hardened their view of America. Farmers, desperate for help, treated the POWs with a mix of practicality and unexpected kindness. Some guards were relaxed, even sitting under trees smoking while the prisoners worked. Farmers sometimes brought cold water, lemonade, or even sandwiches into the fields. A few shared cigarettes, joking with men who only months before had been enemies on the battlefield. Payment, too, was a revelation. Prisoners earned 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, which could be spent back in camp on cigarettes, candy, or toiletries. To men used to being exploited by their own army, the idea of fair compensation, even symbolic, felt astonishing. It suggested respect, however limited, for their dignity as workers. There were moments of humanity that lingered long after the war. Some prisoners struck up friendships with American farm families. Children watched them wide-eyed, surprised that the enemy looked like ordinary young men. In a few cases, farmers even invited prisoners to sit down at outdoor tables for lunch, a breach of regulations, but one born of simple neighborliness. The work also gave prisoners glimpses of everyday America beyond the barbed wire. They saw small towns, schoolhouses, gas stations, and barns with painted advertisements for Coca-Cola or Lucky Strike. They smelled pies cooling on windowsills, heard radios playing swing music from porches, and marveled at tractors more powerful than anything back home. The contrast with bombed-out German cities could not have been sharper. Of course, not all memories were idyllic. The heat in southern fields was punishing, and cotton tore at hands unused to the labor. Guards sometimes grew harsh, reminding the men they were still prisoners, and some locals resented seeing the enemy fed better than poor sharecroppers. Yet, despite these tensions, many Germans later admitted the work assignments were their first taste of something like freedom. At day's end, the trucks carried them back through camp gates, where barbed wire and sentries returned them to reality. But in their pockets were canteen credits, in their minds the memory of American landscapes. And in their stomachs sometimes a peach or apple slipped to them by a farmer's child.
Working the fields did more than fill America's harvest bins. It planted in thousands of German prisoners the seeds of a new perception, that beyond the war and the propaganda, ordinary Americans were not monsters but people, living in a land of astonishing abundance where even prisoners could share in the labor, the wages, and occasionally the hospitality. If the fields introduced German prisoners to the work and rhythms of America, it was the children who revealed the heart of it. At first, encounters were fleeting. A boy standing by a fence, staring at the enemy in khaki work clothes, a girl clutching her mother's hand as trucks of POWs rattled past on country roads. The Germans expected fear or hatred. Instead, they found curiosity. Children waved, sometimes shyly, sometimes boldly, and when guards permitted it, or when they looked the other way, prisoners waved back. It was through children that suspicion melted fastest. Farmers' kids would wander into the fields during harvest, bringing jugs of water or apples to share. They asked simple, disarming questions. Are you really German? Do you have kids back home? Can you say something in your language? The answers, clumsy, halting, but sincere, turned enemies into people. Some POWs had children of their own in Germany. Seeing American boys running barefoot through fields or girls carrying school books awakened a pang of homesickness. They thought of sons growing up under bombs, daughters waiting in hunger. The contrast was painful, but also clarifying. In America, even in wartime, children seemed healthy, well-fed, carefree. Their laughter carried no undertone of fear. In certain camps, school teachers brought their classes to the fences as a kind of civics lesson. The children sang songs, recited poetry, or handed over drawings decorated with flags and flowers. German prisoners pinned those drawings to barrack walls, treasuring them like gifts from their own children. One POW later recalled, "I realized then that the future would not belong to the Reich. It would belong to these children and to a country that gave them such confidence." Church groups organized Christmas card exchanges. American children wrote in shaky letters, "Merry Christmas to you, even though you are far from home." Some tucked small candies or sticks of gum into the envelopes. The German men, hardened by desert campaigns or years of propaganda, sometimes wept quietly over those gestures. There were also unspoken lessons. Watching American children line up at rural schools, books under their arms, POWs saw what education looked like in a democracy, not indoctrination, not fear, but opportunity. For a generation of Germans who had grown up under Hitler Youth banners, this was almost incomprehensible. The encounters planted seeds for the future. Many former POWs, upon returning to Germany after the war, remembered not just the taste of chocolate or the abundance of food, but the faces of children who had treated them not as monsters, but as men. Some resolved to raise their own children differently, to prepare them for a world of peace rather than war. It is said that the true measure of a society lies in how it treats its children. For the German prisoners, America's children were not just a measure but a mirror, reflecting a world they had been denied, and hinting at a future where life could be different. In the end, it was not tanks, planes, or even barbed wire that most deeply disarmed them. It was the innocence of children, waving from fences, sharing apples, and reminding hardened soldiers that the future was not theirs to claim, but theirs to protect. If the farm fields showed German prisoners America's labor, and the children revealed its heart, then the diners, those humble roadside temples of coffee and pie, gave them a glimpse into its soul. The encounters were brief, sometimes accidental. Prisoners assigned to work details outside the wire often passed through small towns, escorted by guards. And in those towns, almost without fail, there was a diner. Neon signs buzzing, chrome stools lined at the counter, the scent of frying bacon drifting out the door. For men raised in a Europe of shortages, the diner was a shock. Here was a place where ordinary people, not elites, not party officials, not officers, could sit down and order a hot meal at nearly any hour of the day. Factory workers, truck drivers, school teachers, even the guards themselves, all sat elbow to elbow at the counter, drinking coffee that flowed endlessly, refilled without hesitation. The symbolism wasn't lost on the prisoners. In Germany, cafes were stratified. Officers took the best tables, civilians stood in ration lines, and soldiers grabbed what they could. In the American diner, hierarchy seemed to dissolve. Black and white workers sometimes ate at neighboring tables. Women came in alone, ordering pie before heading to work. Teenagers crowded into booths, laughing freely. The very atmosphere carried a kind of democracy, messy, noisy, but unmistakably equal. On rare occasions, farmers or guards invited POWs inside. Regulations technically forbade fraternization, but rules bent when hands were needed and trust was earned. A prisoner might be offered a slice of pie or a cup of coffee poured by a waitress who treated him with the same casual politeness as any other customer. For men taught that Americans were decadent barbarians, it was disorienting to be served, however briefly, like anyone else. The menus were another revelation. Bacon and eggs, pancakes with maple syrup, cheeseburgers, milkshakes, banana cream pies, foods that seemed almost mythical in their abundance. Germans knew potatoes, cabbage, and bread stretched thin. To see a list where choice itself was routine, this or that, with or without large or small, felt like stepping into another civilization. Some POWs later recalled that the diner embodied America more powerfully than the camps themselves. It was not the guards or fences that impressed them, but the sight of ordinary citizens enjoying freedom and food without fear. The diner was not propaganda, it was practice. A place where democracy tasted like hot coffee, smelled like frying onions, and sounded like a jukebox playing swing in the corner. Years after the war, when former prisoners returned as visitors, many sought out diners again. They ordered coffee pie and bacon, not just for the flavors, but for the memory of what those meals had once meant, a glimpse of a society where even the humblest establishment held more freedom than an empire built on conquest. For them, the diner was not just a place to eat, it was proof that democracy could be lived daily at a counter with a slice of pie. For all the memories of chocolate, diners, and holiday feasts, the sheer scale of the German POW experience in America is almost as astonishing as the stories themselves. Numbers, cold and factual, reveal what daily life behind barbed wire meant, and why it mattered so much. By war's end, the United States held over 425,000 German prisoners of war spread across the country. From Maine to California, from the Dakotas to deep Texas, there were more than 700 camps. Some massive compounds housing tens of thousands, others small branch camps attached to farms or factories. In effect, America built a hidden archipelago of barbed wire, scattered across the landscape. At the height of the war, these prisoners made up one of the largest labor forces in the nation. They harvested cotton in Texas, picked fruit in California, cut timber in the Pacific Northwest, and shoveled coal in the Midwest. By conservative estimates, German POWs contributed tens of millions of man-hours of labor, keeping American farms and industries afloat while millions of U.S. citizens fought overseas.
The economics were remarkable. Prisoners were officially paid 80 cents per day in canteen coupons, small enough to comply with Geneva Convention limits, but significant inside camp walls. Canteens became miniature economies, selling everything from tobacco to toothpaste, stationery to candy bars. For many Germans, it was their first encounter with consumer choice on such a scale. Food numbers tell an even deeper story. Each prisoner received rations nearly equal to those of U.S. soldiers, about 3,500 calories per day. Compare this with Germany, where rations for civilians had collapsed to below 1,500 calories by 1945, and where meat, sugar, and coffee were virtually non-existent. For a prisoner, the mess hall alone was proof of American abundance. Education also became measurable. By 1946, German POWs had organized what some historians call the greatest university ever behind barbed wire. Across the camps, there were hundreds of classes, from English and mathematics to philosophy and agriculture. More than half of all prisoners took part in some form of study. Thousands earned certificates that later helped them rebuild careers back in Germany. In the barracks-turned classrooms, the war was replaced, however briefly, by ideas. Even repatriation was handled with staggering logistics. Between 1945 and 1946, the U.S. transported over 370,000 Germans back across the Atlantic. Many were first sent to Britain or France for temporary labor before finally returning home. Ships carried them east as fast as Liberty ships had once carried them west. And yet, the numbers are not just statistics. They explain the texture of memory. When a former POW recalled the shock of a sugar bowl or the taste of chocolate, he was one of hundreds of thousands experiencing the same revelation. When a farmer's child handed an apple to a prisoner, that moment joined a web of millions of small encounters that quietly reshaped how an entire generation of Germans saw the United States.
It is easy to speak of battles, tanks, and bombers when telling the story of World War II. But the numbers of the POW camps remind us that another war was fought in mess halls, classrooms, and cotton fields. A war not of destruction, but of exposure. By overwhelming the prisoners with scale, abundance, and order, America taught lessons no speech could convey, and for many Germans who returned home, it was not the barbed wire they remembered most. It was the math of plenty, the calories, the wages, the hours, the classrooms, that told them the future belonged not to scarcity and conquest, but to societies capable of producing more sharing, more and wasting more than the Reich had ever dreamed possible. Even before the end of the war, the story of America's abundance was already slipping through the barbed wire and crossing the Atlantic, not by official propaganda, but through the hands of the prisoners themselves. Every German POW in the United States was allowed to write letters home, usually limited to 24 lines on a single page. Censors carefully blacked out sensitive details, but what they could not erase was tone. Again and again, families in bombed-out German cities received letters filled with quiet astonishment. "We are well fed here. We even have sugar for our coffee. They sell chocolate in the canteen." For civilians scraping by on rations of thin bread and watery soup, such words sounded almost fantastical. Children in Hamburg or Cologne would gather around their mothers as she read aloud the letter from father or brother, and their eyes widened at mentions of chocolate, ice cream, or Coca-Cola. And the letters were not all. The Red Cross allowed POWs to send home small parcels purchased with their camp wages.
Inside were treasures almost unimaginable in Germany: soap, cigarettes, stockings, canned meat, even candy. A bar of American chocolate sent to a child in Bremen was worth more in memory than in calories. It was proof that somewhere life was not hunger, but plenty. The effect was subtle, but profound. The Reich's propaganda machine worked furiously to portray America as decadent, corrupt, and on the brink of collapse. Yet here were fathers and sons, once loyal soldiers, testifying in their own handwriting that the opposite was true. The United States not only fought with tanks and planes, but with sugar, tobacco, and generosity, and it seemed to be winning more decisively with the latter. Sometimes the abundance was so overwhelming that it sparked guilt. Prisoners knew their families starved while they themselves gained weight in captivity. Some admitted to feeling ashamed, writing lines like, "It is hard to eat so much here when I know you have so little." The censors let those lines through, perhaps understanding that honesty itself was a weapon. There were even cases where American guards or camp officials deliberately encouraged prisoners to send abundance home. At Christmas, some camps organized drives where POWs could purchase extra parcels for their families filled with goods unavailable in Germany. What arrived in mailboxes across the Reich were not just packages, but arguments in cardboard and twine, that there was another way to live, another world beyond ration cards and ruins. By 1945, a quiet reversal was taking place. The German home front, once certain of victory, now measured its suffering against the strange news filtering back from the camps, that even their captured men ate better than their children. In this way, the POWs became unexpected ambassadors of truth. They had gone to war as soldiers of conquest. They wrote home as witnesses of abundance. And in the gap between those two identities, entire families began to glimpse the collapse of the old order and the possibility of a different future. By the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled and Germany descended into ruins, the letters and memories carried home by prisoners had already begun to erode the ideological fortress built by Nazi propaganda. What Goebbels had promised as ironclad truths, American weakness, decadence, and internal collapse, fell apart not with speeches or leaflets, but with the testimony of men who had lived as captives inside the enemy's heartland. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. The Nazis had painted America as a mongrel nation of jazz, greed, and racial chaos, incapable of sacrifice or order. Yet German POWs described an opposite reality: factories that operated day and night, railroads that moved goods with mechanical precision, farms that produced harvests so vast that fruit could be thrown away for being misshapen. The very soldiers who had once believed in Aryan superiority now wrote home marveling at Coca-Cola bottles, electric lights in barracks, and the casual waste of sugar. These were not abstractions. They were stories told at kitchen tables across Germany, smuggled through in letters, whispered between neighbors.
A father in Essen might read aloud that his son in Texas had eaten turkey and pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving, while his own family survived on ersatz bread. A mother in Leipzig would show her children the parcel sent from America, chocolate bars wrapped in silver foil, so bright and alien against the gray of bomb-dusted streets. Each small moment chipped away at the great edifice of Nazi mythology. The collapse of the myth was not just about food, it was about what the abundance represented.
To the prisoners, every Coca-Cola bottle revealed a society where production did not serve only elites, but flowed downward to the ordinary citizen, even to captured enemies. Every ice cream sundae was proof that luxury could be democratized. To men who had grown up in a Germany stratified by class, privilege, and racial hierarchy, America's ability to give the same treat to a farm boy, a factory worker, a banker, and even to prisoners, was nothing less than revolutionary. For the ideologues, this was devastating. If America, written off as decadent and weak, could mobilize such industrial might while maintaining social cohesion, then the Nazi promise of a superior, disciplined Germany was revealed as hollow. Instead of proving strength, the Reich had delivered only hunger, rubble, and death. Historians later noted that this psychological collapse was often more decisive than the battlefield defeats. Armies can be rebuilt, cities reconstructed, but once the mind sees through a lie, it cannot unsee. The POW experience ensured that hundreds of thousands of German men returned home not as carriers of Nazi belief, but as witnesses of its failure.
And so, by the war's end, the myths had unraveled. America was not weak. It was strong in a way the Nazis could never replicate. It was not decadent. It was abundant, and its abundance seemed to spring from a system of freedom and democracy rather than from conquest. In barracks and mess halls across the United States, the quiet collapse of Nazi ideology was already complete. All it had taken was a spoonful of ice cream, a fizzing bottle of Coca-Cola, and the undeniable reality that prosperity did not come from domination, but from creation. The war ended, and with it the strange chapter of captivity. Between 1945 and 1946, ship after ship carried German prisoners back across the Atlantic, not in chains, but in orderly transports, men heavier and healthier than when they had been captured. Some had put on 20, even 30 pounds. Many bore the glow of good food and rest, while their homeland waited in shadows. The return was a collision of worlds. These men disembarked into a Germany they barely recognized, cities reduced to skeletal ruins, streets lined with rubble, families hollow-eyed from hunger. Women pushed carts filled with firewood through bombed-out avenues. Children rummaged in garbage heaps for scraps. For the first time, the POWs saw with their own eyes the difference between the land of plenty they had left behind and the devastated Reich they now rejoined. Medical examinations confirmed the contrast. American records noted that the majority of prisoners were released in better health than when they were captured. German doctors, by comparison, recorded civilians suffering from malnutrition, children stunted in growth, mothers anemic. Families who had starved in freedom now met husbands and fathers who had thrived in captivity. It was a reversal so stark it defied explanation, except that the men had seen the truth. The American system could feed even its enemies better than Germany could feed its own people. The emotional toll was enormous. Some returning POWs felt shame at their full faces and well-fed bodies in the presence of thin, frail children. Others were pressed for stories, their families desperate to know what life had been like over there. And so tales of Coca-Cola, chocolate, and ice cream spilled out into kitchens and cellars, becoming part of the whispered folklore of survival. Children who had never seen a chocolate bar listened wide-eyed as fathers described entire camp stores filled with them, available for a nickel. Wives who had boiled turnip peels into soup struggled to imagine ice cream churned by hand in summer sunlight, freely shared with enemies. The psychological impact cut two ways. For some, it deepened the bitterness toward the regime that had promised victory but delivered ruin. For others, it planted seeds of curiosity. If democracy could produce such abundance, perhaps its ideas were not as weak as propaganda had claimed. In both cases, the myth of Nazi superiority was shattered beyond repair. The POWs themselves became unexpected carriers of this revelation. They brought not just parcels of Red Cross coffee or tins of Spam tucked into their duffels, but also stories, sensory memories of sweetness, fizz, and plenty. These stories circulated through towns and villages like contraband, igniting hope in a land that had forgotten the taste of it. Returning to ruins was not only about the physical destruction of cities, but about the collapse of an entire worldview. The Reich had fallen, the cities had crumbled, but what struck the deepest chord was that ordinary Americans could give ice cream to their enemies, while German children had never known such luxury. That contrast was irreversible, and it marked the beginning of a new path forward. The prisoners had gone away as soldiers of conquest. They came back as men who had tasted another way of life, and in the ruins of Germany, that taste lingered, sweet and unforgettable. In the years that followed, the memories of captivity in America rippled quietly through German society. At first, they were fragments, stories told around the dinner table, recollections shared in beer halls, whispers exchanged in bread lines. But these fragments carried a weight far greater than their simplicity. They were not about battles or generals, but about ordinary things: a bottle of Coca-Cola, a slice of chocolate cake, a scoop of ice cream on a hot day. To the men who had been prisoners, these were not trivial details. They were symbols of something deeper, proof that democracy was not just an abstract political system, but a lived experience that translated into abundance, equality, and dignity.
A prisoner could walk into a camp canteen with a nickel and buy the same Coca-Cola as an American guard. Food was not hoarded for elites. It was shared broadly, even with enemies. This was a revelation that undermined every lie of the Nazi regime. The legacy of those experiences did not vanish with the end of the war.
Many former POWs would later become participants in Germany's reconstruction, helping to lay the groundwork for the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s. The vision of a society where prosperity flowed outward to ordinary people had been imprinted on them during their time in America. When combined with the Marshall Plan and Germany's own industrious spirit, it helped fuel a new model of growth. But beyond economics, there was a cultural legacy. German children grew up hearing their fathers' stories about American generosity. Chocolate and chewing gum, once unimaginable luxuries, became emblems of freedom itself when distributed by American GIs during the occupation. For a generation raised among ruins, sweetness was no longer just flavor. It was memory, hope, and a promise of a different future. Historians later describe this as a soft power victory, one achieved not with tanks or speeches, but with sugar, abundance, and fairness.
It was Coca-Cola and Hershey bars, more than pamphlets and radio broadcasts, that planted the seeds of democracy in post-war Germany. While Nazi propaganda had collapsed under the weight of its own lies, democracy rose on something tangible, edible, and unforgettable. For the POWs, the taste lingered all their lives. Many would tell their grandchildren not about battles fought in the desert or the Atlantic crossing, but about the first time they held a bottle of Coke, cold in their hands, condensation dripping down the glass. They would describe the shock of biting into a Hershey bar, the creamy richness of ice cream. These were the memories that endured, not because they were sweet, but because they revealed a truth more powerful than ideology, that freedom could be tasted. And so the legacy of the German POWs in America was not only survival, but transformation. In the long arc of history, their captivity became a bridge. They had gone to war believing in conquest, but they returned believing in abundance. They had once saluted a regime that promised strength through domination, but they came home carrying stories of a democracy that proved its strength through generosity. The sweet taste of democracy was more than a metaphor. It was a lived experience, one that helped turn enemies into witnesses and witnesses into believers.